Hello everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, I'd like to talk to you about foreign languages. Which foreign language should you prioritize if you're thinking of learning yet another foreign language? And of course, English is a language that comes most quickest to mind. And I'll be talking about English as well. But other than English, what other foreign languages are out there and which ones should you prioritize once you, for example, mastered English? And there are a lot of languages are being asked to me, French, German, Spanish, Chinese, Russian, Arabic, Japanese, and so these are kind of the languages that are most often asked to me. But on top of this, Italian, Portuguese, Korean, Hindi, Persian, and Urdu are also languages that I would like to consider, as these, even though they are more niche, are still asked a lot, and I think are still important at the global stage. And so, without any further ado, let's jump into the topic. So at the very base of things, I would like to first talk to you about how should you get to the decision of which language to learn. Of course, certain languages are more often spoken and are more important and whatever. Sure, but if you look at your own situation, your personal situation, you have to eventually decide which language you're going to learn because there's a time investment to it, sometimes there's a monetary investment to it, and so you have to really think well also about your personal situation when you're considering to learn a certain language. So first of all, what's important in this regard is where do you live? And secondly, where do you want to live? Your living environment is very important because, where you're working, where you're doing your groceries, where you're trying to make friends, oftentimes the native language is key, especially if people don't know English that well. If you think about France, if you think about Germany, these are not places where English is so well spoken. At least not by everybody in every region. And so if you're in a region where English is not spoken that well, and if you're thinking of, I'm just going to learn English and then, I will see, then perhaps you're going to be unhappy and unproductive in your life, in your social life. And with that, happiness is very, very important to all of us. And so where you live now, but also where you want to live in the future are important decisions to take into account. On top of this, what's also very important is, what job are you considering to do? And with that, countries become important, but also languages independent of countries become important. What I mean by this is, so if you think about countries becoming important, let's say that you're thinking about career in trade, right? And so if you're thinking about a career in trade, then you have to look at which countries are being traded most with, right? Then you're going to think about the US, about China, about Germany, and you may want to then consider the languages that these countries are using, especially because you're also going to be in trade and you might want to export to or import from these countries, right? It just makes sense. So countries, if they're important to you for whatever reason with respect to your job, because you're going to locate there or whatever, you have to consider the language as important in those countries. But if you think about languages independent of countries, then you might want to think, for example, if you're going to do something in art history, in general history, perhaps, or you're going to do a PhD or whatever, if that's the case, then that certain languages like Latin or like ancient Greek or French even, are very important from this perspective, right? French very important, especially from the Renaissance and onward, right? They're very important revolution, cultural revolution, literary revolution as well. And so you might want to learn French for that reason. But if you go even further back, then Latin and ancient Greek become much, much more important, especially, of course, because of the revolution back in those days from those perspectives. And so sometimes you may want to look at the language independent of the country. So moving forward, what's also important when you judge your personal situation is that you look at, if you consider your languages that you already know, and if you're going to learn this other language on top of it, how much extra benefit are you actually going to accrue from it? If you already know English, how much benefit are you going to get from French? If you already know Spanish, how much benefit are you actually going to get from learning Italian on top of it? And so on. These decisions you have to make because, learning a language costs time, sometimes costs money. So it's very important that you really take this into account. The time and cost argument is also important if you consider languages from a temporal perspective. So languages are to some extent important today. Certain languages are more important than others. But if you look into the future, 10, 20, 40, 60 years from now, you will still be using the language that you're going to learn today. if you think about the time and the cost perspective, and if you think about the fact that you cannot learn all of the languages out there, perhaps you're just going to learn 2 foreign languages, then you really have to think about also which languages are going to be more important in the future, right? And in thinking about that, you may want to already anticipate on it and learn these languages today. So if you keep all of these kind of things aside, if you consider these, they're important, take these into account when you're trying to decide which language to learn. But for the remainder of the video, let's not look at these, and let's try to look at each language by itself, its merits, its qualities, its benefits, and its weight out there in the world, and to see which ones you should be prioritizing over another language. And I will come with a ranking at the very end of the video. So let's start from the start to be complete. So let's start with English, as English is not your native tongue. I have been for my work, right, as an academic, to all over the world, kind of to many locations, and you see that English, one way or another, is really, really going to save you. In the professional point of view, managers, they will kind of one way or another know English, but even people on the street, you will always find someone who knows English. English is so vast, so extensive in terms of in how many places it's known, and it's also so effective if you look at what type of countries have English as their native tongue, right? You see countries like the US, you see countries like UK, like Australia, like Canada, countries that are very important all over the world, very powerful, have English as their native tongue. And so because of that, kind of there's no escaping from learning English. It's just going to help you so much, not just in an economic point of view, not just political, not just technological, but in all sorts of ways. It will most likely help you, even if it is just for tourism. Secondly, the language that I would like to talk to you about is French. So French is a very interesting language. It's a language that's kind of most often asked to me about, should I learn French after English? And my answer is this. I think that French is a very important language, very interesting language, but I think that its importance is in decay. It's depreciating in its value. It was especially more important in the past because of course, France's imperialist history, global power, had so many colonies, and because of that, French is of course known all over the world. But if you look at currently how many countries there are there that you can penetrate with French, that you cannot penetrate with English, then I think there are not really that many. French is still important, still spoken a lot. But if you already know English, then why would you also need French on top of that? Of course, in Africa, in Canada, in Switzerland, French is being spoken a lot. But if you look at English, then, the amount of people speaking French is less. Also, the extra benefits that you're going to get from knowing French on top of English, I don't think are that many. Unless you, of course, go to a country where it is really, really well known that French is really the dominant language, and after French, the other languages are not spoken that much. They will not help you in terms of career progress and so on. Then you may want to consider French, especially also if you're going to France. There also French is quite important. English much less so. Then again, it might be very important to you. Also in certain African countries, French is so much more important than English. Then again, you may want to reconsider. But other than that, if you're going to learn English, if you know English well, I don't think French will help you so much more in terms of unlocking doors that other languages may, that we're going to talk about a bit. So let's, if you wish, continue a bit from Europe, as we've already mainly covered European languages as the first and the second. So in Europe, there are many other languages that are also important. If you look at German is an regional language. Many people don't know that, but it is. Like in Austria, in Switzerland, in a small part of Belgium, in Liechtenstein, German is being spoken. Germany, of course, as a country is important, and these other countries are also quite wealthy countries. They're in the middle of Europe. If you look at Germany in terms of the population, then you also see that German gets weight because of Germany, right? Germany also in terms of economic point of view, in terms of political point of view, technological point of view, it is an important country. And with that, the German language gains importance as a regional language, particularly. If you have to do something in this region, then great, you can learn this language. But if not, then also I think that in most of these countries, one way or another, you'll be able to find your way with English. And even if not, if you don't have to do anything in these languages, then outside of this region, there's not that much benefit that you're going to get from English, from German, because German is very locked in that region, and outside of that region, German is not of that much benefit. And if you're not going to do anything in Germany and Austria and Switzerland, if you don't have that much to do in that region, if you're not going to have a particular trade with these countries or whatever, then I don't think that this is a language that you should per se be prioritizing, especially also looking at the current situation of these countries. They're kind of static, kind of where they are. They're not increasing in their importance per se. They're kind of where they are, economic speaking, political speaking, technologically speaking, and so on. Other countries are developing so much faster that makes these other countries more interesting to consider. Spanish, also a regional language. You can think, of course, Spain itself, right, that speaks for itself, but also South America, also Middle America. There are many countries over there that speak Spanish, and with that, you actually get to a very sizable population. A population that speaks Spanish is much more than a population that speaks German, for example, and that makes Spanish a very interesting language to learn. Also, these countries are in potential at these countries that can grow quite fast. Spanish is also, because Mexico is quite close to the US. In the US, there are many people who speak Spanish because of, immigration. Also, from that perspective, Spanish becomes so much more interesting that you may think, hey, also from that perspective, you may want to consider Spanish. Portuguese, also regional language. Here, of course, you're considering Portuguese mainly because of Brazil, Portugal itself, of course, but then there are also some African countries, some Asian countries that also have some roots in Portuguese and do speak it to some extent. But the most important reason, most likely, why you would want to learn Portuguese is Brazil. If you have something to do with Brazil, a trade, a travel, or whatever, and if this is something that's going to linger on for the mid to long run, you may want to consider Portuguese. But if not, comparing Spanish to Portuguese, I would definitely prefer Spanish. And also, if you consider German, what we've just spoken about, and also that these countries are kind of where they are, kind of static, not that much developing, again, I think I would prefer Spanish here. Italian. Interesting language, but Italian is mainly a national language spoken mainly predominantly in Italy itself. A language that kind of, in terms of level, also kind of is where it is. It's not that much increasing in value, kind of staying where it is from political, technological, social, economic, kind of whatever point of view. And so Italian is not really a language that I would, because of that, consider, unless, again, you have some special arrangement with Italy. Russian. Interesting language, regional language, unless, in contrast to what many people think. Russian is important in Middle Asia. It's very important also in Eastern Europe. It's also important in the Balkans, and because of that, and also because Russia is an important country, you may want to consider Russian. It's, from a strategic point of view, and if you think about energy, if you think about from a military point of view, from its population's point of view, right, 120 million people or so. If you think about the size of Russia as a country, if you also think about where it is located, right, its strategic location, close to the poles, it has a waterway to the Black Sea, and so on. It has very important stakes in the Middle East. Well, then it becomes not that difficult to understand that perhaps Russian is an important language, and it's definitely a language to consider, given the importance of Russia over the past many years, decades, if you wish. Russian is a language that I think is here to stay in terms of importance. So now let's move from Europe to Asia, because Asia is really booming, right? We know that the importance, global importance, at least the weight of economic, political, social, technological importance, kind of moves more towards the east, moves more towards Asia. And so one of the, of course, countries that first comes to mind is China, and with that, Chinese as a language. So Chinese is a national language. Okay, it's not a regional nor a global language. But the thing with Chinese is that there are so many Chinese people, and China is so important that it's very difficult not to consider Chinese as a language. The country is important from economic point of view, right? Growing fast, a sizable economy. On top of this, of course, technological development, right? Huawei, Xiaomi are Chinese companies that have got problems. Simply because these companies are perhaps growing a bit too fast for Western standards. And so, Alibaba, of course, also a Chinese company, is very, very important, and so on. You can name these languages and, or these countries, and they, of course, resemble the growing importance of China as a country, and with that, Chinese as a language. So its population and the geography in terms of size are again also very important to reasons to think of Chinese as a language. Has a strategic importance also because of that, in terms of its location as well, bordering to, for example, India, and also to the sea, Pacific, if I'm not mistaken. So all very important reasons for learning Chinese as a language. So Japanese is a second Asian language that you can think of, also a national language. It's an important country if you look at today, but I don't think it's a country that's going to increase its importance over the coming years. Its economy is big, but it's not really growing that much. Technology is important, but it's also slowing, especially relatively so, with China overtaking it in terms of pace. If you look at the population, stagnated, kind of in a decreasing trend. Military power, many other countries have surpassed Japan already. Size, not really strategic. So I think that Japan's importance on the global stage decreases, and with that, the importance of Japanese also decreasing. Korean, interesting, national language. It's an country of middle importance. The importance in terms of economic point of view, in terms of population, so technology, it's kind of there. The economy is growing. It's quite sizable economy as well. Its population, it's not really growing, but still has a sizable population. In terms of technology, it has some giants over there: Samsung, Hyundai, we know those, right? LG as well. And so some important companies are over there. It's not really that important on the global stage, but if you have to do something with Korean, same thing counts for Japan as well, then you can learn these languages. If you're really looking at Asia, then kind of there's only one language to really consider, especially if you're looking at the China, Korea, Japan triangle. But we're not there yet. Of course, India, and with that, Hindi, of course, also a very interesting language. It's a national language spoken in India itself, but there's some different dynamics going on here. So if you think about India and the amount of people speaking the language, they would think like, hey, this is a language I should learn. But even within the country itself, not everybody speaks it. The country itself is fragmented, so not everybody understands. Some people prefer to speak a dialect or a different version of Indian, or a complete different language, right? And so if that's the case, then the question arises of how important is it for me to learn Hindi, especially if I look at China and if I look at Mandarin, or whatever language is predominantly important in China. I think it was Mandarin. And so if that is streamlined across China, but you don't have the same streamlining across India, well, then the importance of Chinese becomes more important than the importance of India, of Hindi. In this case. And so also in India, they're speaking also English, so that's also interesting. And so that again takes away the importance of learning Hindi, because perhaps you might be able to survive with English itself. So it is an important country nevertheless, economic point of view, population point of view, location point of view, technological point of view, important, growing, also important, also strategically important. But I don't think that the language Hindi is that important, given that Chinese is out there as an option, so Mandarin in this case. So Persian, important, right? Persian is especially important in Iran, also in some Middle Asian countries. They're also important. But especially in Iran, it's important. If you look at Iran in terms of its population, in terms of its strategic location, with the Suez Canal, for example, if you think in terms of energy and in terms of from military point of view, that Persian is an important language, one that you just cannot disregard. From a historic point of view, Persian is also important. From an Islamic point of view, from an historical point of view, in terms of academic works, from a cultural point of view, it's also an important language. And because of that, you may want to consider it. It is in the end a regional language. So if you have to do anything with this region or with these academic works or whatever, Persian is definitely something to consider. Urdu, also quite important, quite interesting and important. Urdu is important because it's spoken in Pakistan and in India. I don't know whether we can call it regional because of that. I would still call it a national language. The language is important, if so, because of Pakistan having quite a population, quite the economic power, quite a military and a strategic location. So from that perspective, it's interesting. But if you look at the alternatives, if you look at Hindi being out there, should you then learn Urdu? Urdu's importance is mainly also from Islamic point of view, also from a historic point of view, cultural point of view. But if you think about Hindi, then of course also a lot of works in India itself go back to the roots of the languages in the country. And so it is a trade-off in that sense. I think that Pakistan, Urdu as a language of Pakistan has perhaps more of interest in terms of historic point of view, but that's because I know the language better. Hindi, I don't know that well about how far it goes into history, whether it's crafted later on, or whether it really has historic roots. But if it also has historic roots, then Hindi and Urdu are kind of on the same level in terms of considering them from a historic point of view. So I think the final region to talk about is the Middle East, and with that, Arabic is important to talk about. Arabic is interesting because it's a regional language, and there are a lot of Arabic-speaking countries. That, of course, makes the appeal of the language more. It's also important. I mean, these countries are important from economic point of view, mainly stemming from energy and for the way in which energy, of course, was invested. From an military point of view, from their strategic location in terms of the Suez Canal, in terms of the seas that's going all the way from Israel all the way until Spain and Morocco. So there's quite a big span also of Arabic speaking countries. Also, some part of Africa, if you go further down, speak also Arabic. And so that makes the language quite vast, quite extensive, and quite appealing to many people to learn, because there are still some merits to learning the language beyond, for example, history, beyond Islam, beyond culture. From that perspective, the language is also very important, but from economic, military, energy, and geographic stance, it's also quite an important language. So if you now think about all of the languages that we've talked about, I mean, they're all kind of important, especially if your personal life, your private situation leads to that language being important. But if you take that out of the equation, then I think my ranking would be as follows. I think English, I mean, that's undisputed. After English, I think Chinese and Russian would be my number 2 and number 3, assuming that you learn English first, right? Because then I'm thinking Chinese and Russian. In Russia, in China, not that many doors will be unlocked with English, and there will be quite a lot more unlocked if you know Chinese and Russian. And so I would definitely vouch for learning Chinese or Russian on top of English. Then in terms of 4th and 5th, I would choose one of the 2 regional languages, Arabic or Spanish. Both important, quite vast geographical area that they are spanning from economic point of view, military point of view, strategic point of view. I think also very important languages. Also historically speaking, and also Arabic especially from a religious point of view. Then I would move down to Portuguese as the final regional language that I also think is quite important, but that I would not really prefer to Arabic or Spanish. After that, I think Hindi, because of the importance of India over the course of time, and I think that Hindi can really help you gain some importance in the country if you have something to do over there, and India's importance in the coming 10, 20, 40 years is just undisputable. Then French, because it's still an important language, global language, but I don't think that there's much to add to English with French, and so that's why I did not really prioritize the language. But no disrespect to the language, is very important. Then, German, because of its importance, regional still, and of course Germany still is quite an important country, and so is Austria and Switzerland also, especially if you look at GDP per capita. So countries to think of. Persian, Urdu come after that. Persian regional language, but if you look at its current state of Iran is quite suppressed. So currently the language does not give you that much, and so more from a cultural, historical perspective, the language will really give you something. Urdu, kind of like India, the reasoning is, but of course Pakistan being of less importance currently in terms of economic, political, technological, and so on power, and so that's why Urdu comes after Hindi. And finally, Italian. It's a nice language to learn, but once you know Spanish, once you know English especially, but also when you know Spanish, there's not that much more that Italian can add to you as a language, and that's why I don't really consider Italian as a language to be learned on top of any of these others in terms of prioritization. I hope this video benefited you. I hope you enjoyed. If so, please don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe buttons. Wish you all the best in the world, and hope to see you soon again.